Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Loving obeisances unto the Supreme Being Vasudeva, who is everything there is. Janmadyasya yato anvayaditaratascha artheshu abhignaswarad tene brahmahridaya adikavaye muhyanti yatsuraya tejo varimridam yatha vinimayo yatra trisargo mrisha dhamna swena sada nirastakuhakam satyam param dhimahi. We meditate upon the transcendent absolute being from whom springs forth this universe. He is present in all that exists and yet distinct from everything. He is fully conscious and totally independent. He revealed to the first seer Brahma the import of Vedic wisdom. The material creation, made of threefold gunas, appears in him as though real, like water in a mirage. Being eternally self effulgent, he is ever free of the illusion, Maya, of the material world. We meditate upon him, the Supreme Being. Nigamakalpataror galitam phalam shukamukadamritadrava sanyutam pibata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavukaha. O devotees who relish a taste for divine love, Bhagavatam is the fully ripened fruit of the wish yielding tree of Vedas, flowing as immortal nectar from Shuka Brahma Rishi. Go on drinking the sweet nectar day after day. So now we are entering the second chapter of the fourth Skandha of Srimad Bhagavatam. After giving a detailed list of all the various rishis and their wives and the various sages and divine beings that were procreated, to start with the creation, the secondary creation, which is the topic of the fourth skandha. Now, the first chapter ended with the brief allusion to the story of Daksha and Sati and Shiva. So now we continue with this story, which will be the main content of the next few chapters, the story of Daksha Yajna. So it was mentioned at the end of last chapter that Sati, the last daughter of Daksha, was married to Shiva, but she dropped her own body of her own accord because she did not like the immense disrespect that was shown by her own father to her husband, Lord Shiva. So, with this, we ended this chapter, and now the second chapter begins. And Vidura asks a question. As always, Vidura, being a very avid and alert listener, always draws out all the stories out of the speaker, just as Parikshit does with Shuka Brahma Rishi. So Vidura asks, how did Daksha, who is so fond of his daughters, happen to bear ill will against Shiva, who is his own daughter's husband, Sati being his daughter, and Sati's husband being Lord Shiva? How would he bear ill will against Shiva? Moreover, he says very beautifully, who would bear enmity and how could anyone bear enmity towards Shiva? Because Shiva is the teacher of all animate and inanimate beings, and he bears enmity to none. He is possessed of a tranquil, peaceful personality, and he delights in his own self and is the object of veneration of the whole universe. So, how nicely Shiva is glorified in this verse in Bhagavatam. He says, Kastam charachara gurum nirvairam shanta vigraham atmaramam katham dveshti jagato daivatam mahat. Charachara gurum, he is the guru of the animate and the inanimate, the whole universe. Nirvairam, he has no enmity. Shanta vigraham, embodiment of peace. Atma Ramam, delights in his own self. Jagato Daivatam Mahat, the Lord of the whole universe. So he says, Vidura says, please tell me what led to the bitterness between Shiva and Daksha and what compels Sati to give up her life. So this is the story. This question will unfold the story of Daksha Yajna over the next few chapters. So, the story, briefly, as we have already seen, is that Daksha conducts a yajna, and in this yajna, he invites everyone, but he disrespects Shiva. First, when Shiva is present in the yajna, he disrespects him very badly, and then he conducts a bigger yajna where he does not invite Shiva. Despite that, Sati goes, but Sati finds out that her father is having no respect towards her, even let alone her husband, and therefore she gets very upset with her father's behavior, and she drops her own body in the fire through yoga. And then, of course, the story goes on that she is born as Parvati to the Himalayas. Parvat is another word for the mountain. So she was born in the mountains, and that's why she is called Parvati. And then she does tapas and reunites with Shiva to be his eternal consort. This is the overall story. And before we go into the specific details of the story, it's important to have the spiritual context behind the story so that we fully appreciate the story. Daksha represents the mind. So when Daksha does yajna, it is the activity of the mind. And when the mind does its activity, the mind is interested in the power, the energy, but not in the source of the energy. So the energy is called Prakriti, as we've already seen, and the source of the energy is Purusha. And that is exactly what Shiva and Shakti also represent. Shiva is the source of energy. Sati represents the power or the energy of the Supreme Being. So, what the mind is interested in is only the energy, the power with which it can engage in actions for gratifying itself without acknowledging that this very energy is coming only from the one divine source, and therefore the divine source is the only true object of veneration. Disregarding this, disregarding the presence of God, only engaged in its own gratification through the energy of God, the mind gets lost. And that's what Daksha represents, the mind that is engaged in activities while only valuing the energy of God without giving respect to the source of the energy, which is the Supreme Lord, is Daksha, and therefore he respects Sati but not her husband, Lord Shiva. And this is, interestingly, there is a story in Mahabharata too, which has an exactly similar parallel. Before the war of Mahabharata, when Duryodhana goes to Krishna along with Arjuna, they both go at the same time, and they both say that they want Krishna's help for the war. And so Krishna says, you can ask what you want. And Arjuna says, Krishna says first, there are two things. There is me, and I'll come to one side without any weapons. I'll not bear any weapons. I'll just come. And then on the other side, I can send my entire army called the Narayana Sena. So one can get me and one can get my Narayana Sena. And sure enough, Arjuna says, Oh Krishna, all I want is you. I don't want anything else. If you are next to me, that's enough. Whereas Duryodhana was very happy to hear this from Arjuna, because he says, what a fool. What is Krishna going to be able to do without even taking weapons? I'm happy because I'm going to get the entire Narayana Sena. So he says, I'll take the Narayana Sena happily. But of course, the entire Sena of Narayana Sena does not help Duryodhana, because the wielder of the Sena, Krishna, is with Arjuna. So this is an exact parallel, the same metaphor, that the energy of Krishna is Narayana Sena and Krishna is the source. If we accept the energy of Krishna without the wielder of the energy, which is what Duryodhana did, he went to destruction. Whereas Arjuna only wanted the source of the energy, and thereby he got everything. Similarly, here Daksha too wanted, just like Duryodhana, only the energy but not the source of energy. So he wanted Sati but not her husband, Lord Shiva, and therefore he also went to destruction. So, this is the spiritual symbolism that's very applicable to all of us, that it is very important to recognize that the source of all activities, the source of all our faculties is the Supreme Lord, and therefore He alone is the author of every action, and He alone needs to be recognized as our very source. If we are instead only engaged in activities and claim ownership of those activities, it will lead us to the dark path of destruction. So that's the spiritual symbolism of Daksha Yajna. With this background, we can go through the next few chapters where this story unfolds beautifully, driving home this lesson. So, now Maitreya replies to Vidura and says, once all the great sages and seers and divine beings were all assembled for a sacrifice session that was organized by Daksha, and Daksha appeared there shining like the sun, and because of his brilliance, everybody stood up there. But in that assembly, Brahma and Shiva were also there, and they did not rise up because Brahma is the father of Daksha. As we saw, Daksha is a Prajapati who was a mind born son of Brahma, and Lord Shiva, the supreme being, the destroyer of the universe, was seated there calmly because he does not move either to get up to respect anyone or to expect anyone to respect him. He was simply seated in his own silence. But seeing this, Daksha got very annoyed. He was expecting Shiva to respect him. So he said, he looked at Shiva with very angry eyes, and he said, I am very upset that in this assembly there is this fellow who is giving me disrespect. So now the mind, when it gets polluted with its own ego, it starts disrespecting. It speaks atheistically, it speaks that there is no such thing as God, and disrespects people who believe in God, and disrespects the very idea of God. We see this all the time, and this is what Daksha represents. So he abuses Shiva. He says, the shameless fellow has wrecked the fame of this entire uh, congregation, and he is an arrogant person who is violating the path of the virtuous. He has taken Sati as his wife, even though he does not deserve her. He's got eyes like monkey. So he is using all kinds of abusive language. He says Markatalochana. He says this Shiva has eyes like a monkey, and he does not even have any courtesy to get up and show me respect. He is impure, he is arrogant, he has abandoned all pious activities, he has outstepped or transgressed all bounds, and he is always surrounded by spirits and ghosts. And then he's starting to describe Shiva, because Shiva always goes around in matted locks and in burial grounds wearing garland of skulls. And this is the description given of Shiva. There is a lot of symbolism in this description. Garland of skulls represent the egos that are ultimately destroyed through time, and that's why the burial ground or the cremation ground represents the place of Shiva, and the ashes that are there is worn by Shiva on his own body. All this symbolism is there, but Daksha does not see all this, as many even now do such criticisms. They do not get the symbolism, and they just go by the outer appearance, and they find these to be superstitions or they criticize them. So similarly, Daksha says, this fellow is wearing this kind of skulls, garland of skulls. He is going around like a madman in, cremation grounds. He is bathed in the ashes of funeral piles and he is wearing ornaments of human bones. This is actually a beautiful description of Shiva because it has all this symbolism, but he doesn't see it. He says, Preta Vaseshu Ghoreshu Pretair Bhuta Ganair Vrtaha. So he is Shiva is in the residing in the cremation grounds and wearing the ashes of funeral pyres and the bones as ornaments and skulls as his garland. And but Daksha criticizes all this and he says this Shiva is like a drunken man, and therefore drunken people are drawn to him, and he is such an impure and evil minded person. So very strongly Daksha criticizes Shiva, and then after that he even utters a curse. And the great thing is, while all this is going on, Shiva simply remains still. It says Girisham Apratipam Avasthitam. He says Girisham, the supreme lord of Kailasha, was just sitting there silently, unmoved. He was neither affected by it, nor did he show any reaction. He was simply sitting silently as Shiva. But this fellow Daksha then announced a curse. He said, you shall no longer get any share of this sacrificial offering that I am performing, and therefore you will get nothing. And saying this, he leaves in anger from that place, from that congregation. So when this happens, Shiva's attendant Nandishwara, he becomes very angry at this act of Daksha and also all the Brahmanas there who are sitting silently. So he utters a curse. He says, this fool Daksha, who is bearing enmity to Shiva, who has no vindictive spirit in him. Shiva is so peaceful, and yet towards Shiva, this fellow Daksha is having so much enmity, and he is taking his body as his own self, and therefore he shall have his face turned away from truth. So, whatever Nandishwara says here is on the face of it about Daksha, but we can see how it is entirely applicable to the mind that is caught in its own ego. So, this is what is the symbolism of Daksha, as we said. So, Nandishwara says, this fool, which can be referred to the foolish mind, is always taking the body as his own self, and therefore his face is turned away from truth, attached to his home and his duties, which are only causing self deception in search of pleasures, and cheated by various promises of various scriptures. Even he shall always remain engaged in empty rituals. Again, we can see all this applied to Daksha also applies to the mind, that which is always attached to the home, to duties that are only causing self deception, as if one is the savior of one's own family and relations and taking great attachment towards them, and engaging in rituals and prayers even only with the desire of such worldly results. So, this is what he is cursing Daksha. This is what he will become. The mind that is ever contemplating on the false self has forgotten the nature of the true self, and that's what Daksha remains. He has forgotten the nature of true self, and therefore Nandishwara says Daksha shall be excessively fond of women, and his head will be changed to that of a goat. So, this again represents a symbolic attribute of the mind is always drawn to lust, and the because of that it stops being human and becomes like an animal. And that's what he says here to Daksha will become like his head will be replaced with that of a goat, and he will be excessively fond of lust. And this stupid fellow thinks of the addiction to rituals as wisdom. So this is what the mind always does. And so he says Daksha will consider wisdom to be addiction to rituals, addiction to mechanical practices, addiction to various worldly results, and therefore he has slighted Lord Shiva, and therefore he shall be born in this world again and again. And with the mind bewildered by the sweet words of the Vedas, he will always remain infatuated. So he says, uh, Giraha Shrutayaha Pushpinya Madhugandena Bhurina. So, this expression, flowery words of Vedas, he says, Daksha will be always drawn to the flowery words of Vedas, and thereby he will be bewildered. Interestingly, the similar expression is used by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. He says, Yamimam Pushpitam Vacham Pravadanti Avapaschitaha Vedavadaratah Partha Nanyad Asti Iti Vadinah. So Krishna says too in the Gita that there are those who are attracted to the flowery words of scriptures and of the Vedas and thereby get bewildered. And that's exactly what Nandishwara says of Daksha, which represents the mind that is attracted to even rituals and flowery words of scriptures without getting their essence. And then after that, he also says he will eat anything and everything, making no distinction between what is worth eating and what is not. And he will also be devoted to empty learning, empty austerities, empty vows, while roaming around seeking delight only in wealth, physical comforts, and gratification of the senses. Again, all this perfectly, this curse to Daksha perfectly summarizes the state of the normal human mind, eating anything and everything without any discrimination, just going behind sensory pleasure and eating food of all kinds without any discrimination, and being devoted to empty learning, empty austerities, empty vows, only for sensual pleasures and gratification and physical comforts and wealth. He will roam around even though with all the wealth as a beggar. So, this is what Nandishwara pronounces as a curse on Daksha, which is a very apt description of the state of the mind itself, which is what Daksha symbolizes. So, in any case, this curse is being given by Nandishwara. Then, Bhrgu, the sage there sitting there, he says in reply to that, because Bhrigu is a Brahmana and he sees that Nandishwara not only insulted Daksha but also all the Brahmanas there. So therefore Nandishwara's curse is replied to by Bhrigu, and he says, and this also has become true, he says that those who observe vows towards Shiva will end up living with matted locks, ashes and bones around them, and they will also engage in activities which are outside the purview of Vedas. So this is actually a curse that has become true, the curse given by Bhrigu, that there are to be seen many followers of Shiva who do not follow the injunctions of the scriptures in any way, and many times they also get bewildered by taking uh, drugs of some kinds and substances and all this is seen in many parts of Bharat even today. And this is something that Bhrigu says that this will happen, that even though Shiva is the supreme being, those who are drawn to Shiva, some of them will take to such kind of substances and activities which are outside the purview of scriptures, drawn to many practices and activities which can also cause bewilderment because of the wrong ways in which they go about. So, in fact, what happens is one can see that many take things like drugs of various kinds for spiritual experiences and take to various types of yoga. So all of these are seen, and one can even encounter such people in the Himalayas or in other parts who are outwardly drawn to Shiva, but they are actually bewildered because of such practices. And that's what Bhrigu says here, that will happen to those who are drawn to Shiva. Some of them, not of course, there are many pure devotees of Shiva who are in the spirit of goodness and who are purely engaged in true surrender to the Supreme Being. But then there are many like this too, and that's what Bhrigu says. So, what happens is while this is going on, first Nandishwara cursing, first Daksha leaving the congregation, then Nandishwara cursing Daksha, and then Bhrigu in reverse saying some things about some who are drawn to Shiva. While all this is going on, Shiva is sitting there silently, and then it says he leaves the assembly hall very silently. And then after he leaves, the sacrifice, whatever it was organized there, goes on for some time and it's completed, and they all take bath, and with this chapter ends. Now now that this has happened, where Daksha has disrespected Shiva and left the hall, and after that all these curses have happened, what ensues in terms of Sati's reaction to her father's activities and what happens because of that will be seen in the next few chapters. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.